Good evening and welcome to Domination Submission Radio. My name is Mike Makai and I am your host with the most DS, BDSM, kink, and fetish talk on Blog Talk Radio. This show is about the BDSM and DS lifestyles, and it's a call-in show. So if you want to call in and tell us what you think, ask a question, or just vent, then the number is 347-857-1862. Again, write this down. You know you're going to call me. 347-857-1862. Call in, just tell this call screener what you want to talk about, and we'll try and get you on the air. I am the author of Domination Submission, the BDSM Relationship Handbook, which is available at Amazon, Books A Million, and Barnes & Noble, and has just been picked up by a good-sized retailer in Oklahoma, Texas, and Missouri called Christie's Toy Box. So we want to welcome them as the newest vendor of my book. We have a chat room that you can visit and probably even talk in if you have registered for a free account at Blog Talk Radio. So if you're listening to us live on Blog Talk Radio, just scroll to the bottom of the page and you will see the chat room there at the bottom. And just tell us what you think in there. If you're too shy to call in and ask a question, you can ask it in the chat room and we'll try and give your question some time on the air. We have a website. Check it out at domination-submission.com. It's domination-submission.com. And if you want to follow us or follow me on Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn, the links are all there on the website, so please check that out. My co-host tonight is Little Red. Little Red is a masochist extraordinaire and otherwise known as Too Much Coffee Girl. How you doing, Red?
I am all giggly and bouncy and espressoed. I'm awesome.
That should make for an interesting show tonight. Well, we're going to be talking tonight about extreme BDSM and edge play, which in the minds of many people are one and the same, extreme BDSM and edge play. And a lot of people immediately think edge play, that means you're playing with sharp edges and knives and things like that. And it is used in that context sometimes. But for the most part, when you hear the words edge play, what you're referring to there is extreme BDSM. So we're just going to kind of call it either one during the course of the show tonight. So any thoughts right off the bat about extreme BDSM and edge play, Little Red?
Everybody's got their own definition, and what's extreme and edgy for me is not extreme and edgy for you.
This is true. This is true. Well, you know, that is one of the basic definitions of edge play, of course, is something that is kind of outside the mainstream. Now, this is kind of interesting because you're applying that concept to a culture that is itself outside of the mainstream. So what you end up doing is you're looking at people in an alternative lifestyle who are outside the mainstream themselves and applying a norm to that, and then saying, okay, well, what you're doing or what they're doing is even outside of that mainstream, even further on the edges of acceptability, even within the kink community. And this is a very fluid, very flexible definition in terms of what actually constitutes edge play. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that, I think. And we're also going to address the fact that there are a lot of things that were considered edgy and extreme 20 years ago, 10 years ago, that are no longer considered that way. And in fact, there are some things that weren't considered edgy or extreme 20 years ago, which are now. So I think that's going to be something that is going to be very interesting to talk about. Oh, before I get too deep into the show here, I just want to send regrets from L.B. Shaw, who is normally on the show as our co-host. She's unable to be here tonight, so we wish her well and hope she's back soon helping us out with her keen insights and commentary. So we miss you, L.B. We want you back. So, Red,
I didn't do it.
You didn't hurt her or anything, did you?
Oh, absolutely not. I absolutely adore L.B.
She's great. She's awesome. So we want her back quick. So hope she gets better. Now, Red, do you consider yourself an extreme practitioner of BDSM? Do you like edge play?
Some of it, yes. Some of it is not my kink, and I'm happy for those that enjoy it. And some of it's beautiful artwork, and I can watch it, but it's not something I would probably do.
Mm-hmm. When somebody tells you that they're into edge play, what's the first thing you think about?
Hook suspension, knife play, things like that.
Mm-hmm. And do those things kind of squick you out? I'm using the word squick. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it kind of makes you squeamish and makes you go ick. So that's squeamish, icky, squicky. So anyway, so does that squick you out?
No, it's not in any realm of I want to check that block off zone, so I can watch it, especially hook suspension or knife play. that involves blood play, but it's not something that I'm particularly drawn to, so I can watch it, it's fine, but other than that, it's not for me.
Yeah, I'm kind of the same. I'm right there in that boat with you. I'm not really a big fan of most of the practices that are considered part of edge play. I am familiar with them. I'm even trained in a few of them, but I mean, they just don't do a whole lot for me. So for the most part, I don't bother or tend to give it a wide berth. The definition, again, we've mentioned that the definition can vary from one decade to the other or even 1 year to the other. But for the most part, edge play and extreme BDSM is evaluated on the basis of a couple different standards. And over the last couple of decades, there have been really two major standards and a lot of minor standards that have applied to trying to determine what is and what isn't acceptable, or what is or isn't edgy or dangerous. And I guess the two major ones would be SSC, which is safe, sane, and consensual, and RACK, or RACK, which stands for risk-aware consensual kink. Now, you're familiar with both of those, aren't you, Red?
I am. It's very much like a safety assessment, so I do that every single time I go to play.
Mm-hmm. Some people like safe, sane, consensual. Some people like the risk-aware consensual kink. Which is the one that you tend to adhere to, or that you like more?
I actually do a blend because I'm taking my own safety in my hands, so I have to make sure what I'm doing is good for me, and I'm not running any risk of crossing my hard lines. Or accidents do happen, but we try to minimize as much as we can, especially when you're going into the darker end of the rabbit hole in Alice in Wonderland's little wonderful BDSM world.
There's a dark end of the hole?
Yeah, you have your lighter kinks and your nicer, sweeter kinks, and then you have your darker end of the spectrum.
Okay, gotcha. Just for our listeners, SSC, or Safe, Sane, and Consensual, is a standard that's been applied since the early 1980s. I think it dates to about 1982 or 1983. And believe it or not, it was put forward as a way to evaluate what is and isn't safe, primarily for the gay leather subculture at the time. 1983, you're talking, what is that, 30 years ago at least? My math is bad.
Yeah.
Anyway, 1983 is when we first started using safe, sane, and consensual as a standard for what is and isn't edgy or dangerous. Now, there's some problems with that, aren't there, Red? What would you say right off the bat is a problem with using just safe, sane, consensual as a standard for determining those sorts of things?
Well, you're running the risk because there are more hardcore edge play now. So safe, sane, and consensual is applying to what you and your partner consider safe, sane, and consensual. It's not a standard definition saying this is what's safe, this is what's sane, this is what acceptable is consensual, versus through the whole community versus what is acceptable in this particular dungeon or that dungeon or this set of partners.
Mm-hmm. You are a former Army medic, and so you tend to see things through a different lens than a lot of other people do in terms of what is and isn't safe, what is and isn't smart in terms of risk of injury and that sort of thing. Is there anything out there that you can do that is 100% safe?
Absolutely not.
Yeah, walking across the street isn't 100% safe. Is that correct?
Going to sleep in your own bed isn't safe because
that's where most
you
people
could have
die.
a heart attack and not wake up.
Actually, no. Bed is the second most common place for people to die. You want to know where the first most common place for people to die is?
I would say the living room couch.
No, it's the toilet.
Oh,
yep.
Thanks. Now I'm going to have nightmares. Great.
Well, think about this. Where do you go when you don't feel good? So, anyway, that's...
Yeah.
I'm a fountain of useless information. Anyway, so safe, sane, and consensual, SSC, was the standard for a long time, but there was a lot of controversy about this, and part of that hinged on what is and isn't safe. And as we just mentioned, there's nothing that's entirely safe. And so what people did for a long time was they decided, okay, well, there's nothing that's entirely safe, so what we're going to do is we're going to apply a standard of less safe or more safe. So you never heard anyone say, well, it's safe to engage in fire play or knife play or gun play or something like that. What they'll say is, well, it's less safe than, say, just straight bondage play or something like that. So it became kind of a comparable standard where you compare one thing with the other and see which is more safe. But then you had another problem, because it isn't just safety that's part of this creed of safe, sane, and consensual, but sane. What's sane? And I know asking you what sane is kind of like asking Santa Claus whether the Easter Bunny exists. Give it a shot there, Red.
Clinical definition of sane or my definition of sane are two different things. But sane would be any acceptable norm. Say, getting into your vehicle and going to Starbucks for a cup of coffee. That would be a sane activity because there's truly no inherent risk in it other than, obviously, the other drivers on the road. Me being tied up, bound, and flogged, there's an inherent risk in that. I can asphyxiate, I can break a bone, and that would be considered unsafe, insane act to some people because they just don't get it.
Well, they applied the same kind of standard to the sanity portion of this standard that they try to do with the safety. So they realized at some point that nothing is entirely safe, and so they became obsessed with, more safe, less safe. But then came the sanity thing, and there are a lot of people out there who say that BDSM itself is not a sane activity. Obviously, all the people out there who consider it to be inherently extreme, no matter what it is you're doing in the lifestyle. And so here you had this weird situation where we were applying a standard to our lifestyle that went completely against the exact same standard applied by everyone else against our lifestyle. Am I making sense there? I mean, all the people who are vanilla out there are saying, BDSM is not a sane thing to be doing. And here we are using that as a standard on what we should or shouldn't do within the lifestyle. Well, is it sane or is it not? So I think it caused probably more confusion than was probably necessary. And of course,
for a very long time, BDSM type of behavior, being bound, flogging, things like that, in the DF lifestyle was considered a mental disorder. It was considered an actual mental defect because no one understood it, so they actually classified it as a mental defect for a very long time. Well,
and as I point out in my book, masochism and sadism are classified into several categories, and the higher categories are considered mental disorders and pathological and dangerous mental disorders. And so, there's still people out there who will classify what we do as not sane. And so this became less and less useful to people in the lifestyle, I think. And again, I was going to mention consent. Consent is pretty cut and dry. There should be, at least, no questions or any doubts about whether or not somebody is consenting to anything. But again, you have a lot of people out there who would and will and have pointed their fingers at the lifestyle and say, that person may be consenting, but they've been brainwashed. They've been fooled into believing that this is enjoyable or that it's fun or that it's okay. And so, again, what we consider to be consent, other people would say, abused women go back to their husbands after they've been rescued. They more often than not go right back to the abuser. Are they consenting to the abuse? And does that therefore not make it abuse? And so I think the whole safe, sane, consensual thing was okay to a point, but it just didn't necessarily fit the bill in terms of explaining the lifestyle or giving us a good yardstick by which to measure any kind of ethical behavior in the lifestyle. So then we came up with RAC, and that's risk-aware consensual kink. And we're going to talk about that when we come back from the break. This is Mike Makai and Little Red. You're listening to DS Radio, and we'll be back in about a minute and a half. And we are back. You're listening to DS Radio. I'm Mike Makai. My co-host is Ricochet Rabbit, pinging off the walls with too much espresso, Little Red. And we are talking about extreme BDSM. What is it? Why is it important? Why is it important even if you're not going to engage in it? And what are some of the standards by which we judge it? And then we're going to talk about some of the specific activities which may or may not be on that list of extreme BDSM activities. And so we were talking before the break about RAC. And RAC is risk-aware consensual kink. Any thoughts on RAC, Red?
You should be doing RAC more than you do SSC, even though you do need to do SSC, for the simple fact that you need to be aware of the possibilities of what may or may not happen during the particular scene you're doing, and understanding that, yes, there's the possibility of this could happen or this could happen, and take it into account on what you're comfortable in doing.
Well, I think there are some drawbacks or some flaws in the standard being applied in risk-aware consensual kink, and some of those are very similar to what we encountered in the safe scene consensual thing. Well, RAC first hit the scene about 1999, I guess, and it has really only been around for, 13, 14 years now, and so it's relatively new, and there are a lot of people holding that up as a standard which does not have any of the problems that SSC did. But I'm not sure I agree with that. For example, one of the reasons they implemented this RAC philosophy is going back to the idea that, well, nothing is entirely safe. And how safe is safe enough? Well, again, it's one thing to say, all right, let's do away with that standard, and let's just say, okay. It's better to be aware of the safety issues involved. You're not ever going to do something that's entirely safe, but you should be aware of the risk. And that sounds pretty reasonable, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, for anybody either coming into the lifestyle and they're new for it, or more experienced in the lifestyle, so that way you're knowledgeable about what's going on.
Sure. But remember, now the flaw in the previous standard was how safe is safe enough, right? Okay, so now we've shifted the focus so that it's not on how safe is safe enough, but are you aware of the risks? The question I have for you is, how aware is aware enough? You fall right into the same trap.
Yeah, because it varies, from scene to scene, dynamic to dynamic, person to person. I'm more medically inclined to look at it from a medical perspective, going, how bad am I going to end up in the ER on this one, versus some people going, oh, that looks like fun.
Sure. And again, there are people who can be aware of the risk, but are not actually calculating the risk. So, for example, somebody is engaging in an activity, and you say, hey, oh, by the way, that's going to cut about 2 inches into your skin, and they say, oh, yeah, I know. Now, does that make it better somehow, that now they're aware that they're going to be seriously injured, but do it anyway? You see what I'm saying? I believe that the awareness thing is kind of a trap that people get into, thinking that, okay, I'm aware of the risk, therefore it is a perfectly acceptable risk. And I'm not sure that necessarily follows. Being risk-aware for an educated person who has given it some thought and actually calculated the risks of their activity, I think it's one thing, and it's probably a useful tool. But there are an awful lot of people out there who will ignore a warning that anybody gives them. When you say, hey, I wouldn't do that, that's going to end up resulting in an infection. And you and I both know that infection is a big deal, particularly in anything that breaks the skin or transmits body fluids or whatever. Infection is a big deal. And when you say, oh, well, you could get an infection from that, how many times do people go, oh, okay, I'm not going to do it? Never. I'm going to answer my own question. Never, okay? And you know it, and I know it. People just blow it off. And so
I agreed with you. I was right there with you. Surprisingly, not a lot of people take that as seriously as they need to.
Right. So, I think there's still some problems that we can attribute to risk-aware consensual kink as a standard. There's not ever going to be a perfect standard that isn't flawed in some way, and I think it's a pretty good standard as standards go for evaluating the risk of an activity. But I think there's still some problems there, and I've seen it, and I know you have seen it as well. When you say, "Hey, I'm not sure you ought to be doing that," yeah, that's gonna leave a mark. That's going to get infected. That's going to make you sick. I have actually told people, that's going to put you in the hospital for 2 weeks, and they went, that's okay.
And that's why I base my evaluations on, is this sending me to the ER, and how long am I being in the hospital for if I get sent to the ER? That's my standard for it.
Well, you're a medical professional, or at least a former one, so I mean, that explains a lot. So we're going to move on. Oh, actually, there's a third standard which I came across the other day, which I thought was pretty interesting, and it's not a widely practiced, or it's not a standard that most people are aware of, but it's called PRICK, P-R-I-C-K, and it stands for Personal Responsibility and Informed Consensual Kink. And what this does is it attempts to take this evaluation standard one step further than risk-aware consensual kink. Because what did we say the problem could be with risk-aware consensual kink? The problem is, okay, I'm aware of it, and I'm going to ignore it. Well, this standard, the PRICK standard, is an effort to say, all right, but it's your personal responsibility. You can ignore it if you want, but at a certain point, you have to take responsibility for the fact that you're going to spend the next 2 weeks in the hospital, or you're going to take responsibility for the fact that you're going to rack up some huge medical bills or whatever, and not blame it on the guy who's swinging the flogger or swinging the cane or tying you to the bed or whatever. I mean, at a certain point, we have to take responsibility for our own decisions. And so I think this is kind of an interesting, not just because it's a funny acronym, PRICK, but I think it's a great attempt to assign personal responsibility to people who make stupid decisions, and preferably they are informed and make good decisions, but that isn't always the case. So I think it's a good thing to keep people accountable. What do you think?
I think everybody is responsible for their own well-being, regardless if they're topping or bottoming, and everything ultimately will fall on your shoulders because you can't turn around and go, oh, I didn't know. Well, if you're too stupid to understand the risk, then you shouldn't be doing it. But that's my personal opinion.
Well, I agree with you in that regard. But there's a lot of gray area there, and there are an awful lot of people out there who are trying to escape personal responsibility for their stupid decisions, and that's kind of a personal pet peeve of mine. But we'll cover that in another show. So let's talk about some of the things that were once considered edgy or extreme forms of BDSM play, but no longer are. And one of them is one of your favorite activities, and that would be fire cupping or flame play or fire play. Got any thoughts on why it was once considered edgy and why it's becoming more and more mainstream now? Or do you think it is becoming more mainstream?
It's very much coming more mainstream. I'm seeing a lot more, through some of the fetish websites and things like that, a lot more people are becoming aware of its benefits of sensual play and sensory play and things like that. So more and more people are now getting into it. I still consider it to be a form of edge play, and I always will because of the inherent danger, because I myself have been burned during fire cupping, and I have a scar now from a simple 2-second longer than it should have burned. I now carry a scar for the rest of my life for it. So I still consider it very much to be edge play because the inherent danger is you're running a risk of 2nd and 3rd degree burns, which can lead to infection and sepsis and, a host of other things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fire cupping, for the folks who aren't really aware of it, is using flame to evacuate the air of a jar, which is placed on the skin, and then it sucks the muscle and skin up into the jar. And it's a form of therapy for a lot of people. And if you're interested, we did do a show a couple of months ago on fire cupping, where I interviewed our good friend Shubin, who is a practitioner, and in fact the person who taught you, Red, how to do it. And it's a great show, so if you have a chance to listen to that, you might want to go back into our archives and check it out. But it is you're right, there is a lot of inherent risk in flame play of any sort, and especially fire cupping, because you're applying a flame to a flammable liquid either very close to the person's skin or sometimes even on the person's skin. And all it takes is a few drops out of the cupping jar or the cups onto the skin, and you have the potential for a a bad thing to happen, particularly if the cupping is done as a form of massage and the skin already has oils on it. And, any kind of oil is going to be flammable. So if you're lighting the alcohol or the mentholated oils or whatever you're using in your cups to evacuate the oxygen out of that cup, and it drips onto that oil on somebody's back, suddenly their whole back is on fire. So it could be very easily a dangerous situation that develops out of the blue, totally unexpected. So, yeah. But it's interesting in the sense that 10 years ago, fire cupping was definitely considered a form of edge play. Today, it's not so much. It's just become so widespread, and I'm not saying that everyone's doing it, but, there are enough people doing it that you have, usually in any group, you've got, 3 or 4 people who know how to do it, and that's probably as good as you're going to get on something like that, which is a little bit out of the mainstream, but not considered horribly dangerous anymore. What else do you think you would have been on the list of types of edge play maybe 20 years ago that aren't anymore?
One of the things we were talking about earlier was the needle play. Mm-hmm. It's becoming more and more commonplace. It's very decorative, very beautiful. For anybody who doesn't know about it, what you do is you take the hypodermic needle end, and you can create patterns in the skin with different colored clasps, I guess you can call them, that attach to the syringe. And you can make beautiful flower designs and different patterns in the skin. And
yeah, most people aren't using the hypodermic needle ends, mainly because the hypodermic needles are hollow and they're bigger and they hurt more. Most people are using the acupuncture needles, which are not hollow, and in fact they're so tiny that you barely feel them when they pierce your skin. And you can buy a box of 100 of them for like $2 or something. It's really cheap. So it's not expensive, and I think the popularity of tattooing over the last couple of decades has reduced people's natural aversion to needles, I think, and so you're seeing a lot more people now using acupuncture needles to create works of art on somebody's back or their stomach or their breasts or wherever. And it's not something that appeals to me, but I have to admit, when you see one of these works of art, you can't help but appreciate how much effort and creativity goes into some of these things. And there's certainly a technique of being able to do this. You don't just start stabbing people in the back with needles and create a work of art. Most people have to somehow arrange a stencil on the back that doesn't cause an infection or anything like that. So it's very delicate work, and it takes a long time. And obviously, if you're squeamish about needles, you probably don't want to engage in it. I know you're not squeamish about needles because you're a former medic, and I'm trained as a combat lifesaver medic. So neither of us is squeamish about needles. And yet, did you say you were or weren't interested in needle play personally, Red?
What's funny about it is I do get slightly squeamish at it, considering I have 8 tattoos and piercings, and I've worked with needles doing blood draws and things like that. But when it comes to the needle play itself, I do get kind of squeamish because I'm like, oh, I'm watching an infection happen right there. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, obviously you take proper precautions, and those precautions include more than just making sure that your implements are sterile, but making sure that your hands are clean, making sure that the surface of your skin surface for your bottom, and I don't mean your bottom like your tush, but your submissive or your bottom in terms of scene play, is clean. So you want to use some alcohol swabs or something on their back or their tummy or their breasts or wherever you're poking them with needles. And the other thing you have to remember is a lot of times they're not just poking needles into the skin, but they're poking them through the skin. So it pokes in one end and the tip of the needle pokes back out again. So you kind of pinch a little bit of skin and then you poke it right through that pinch so that the tip is sticking out. Okay? You have doubled the risk of infection, because not only now are you punching bacteria into the skin when you puncture the skin the first time, but then when you remove the needle, you're pulling it back through the skin because of the exposed tip on the other side. So you've now doubled the risk of infection. So it's something you want to think about, and you definitely want to make sure that you are disinfecting the site of any needle play. And that kind of takes us to other areas that were at one time not considered to be edge play, but are now. And I can remember, you're probably, I'm showing my age here, but I do remember a pre-AIDS society where blood wasn't considered a hazardous or toxic substance. And so 30 years ago, when the notion of drawing a little blood came up, it wasn't considered to be a life-threatening thing. It was like, well, how much blood? Now, it doesn't, it's one drop of blood, and it's considered to be a toxic substance, which can lead to your eventual death if that person is infected with the HIV virus or any other number of sexually transmitted diseases, or even not sexually transmitted diseases. There are some very dangerous things that can be transmitted that way that have nothing to do with STDs. So 30 years ago, drawing a little blood, not considered edge play. Today, absolutely considered edge play. So it's called different things in the lifestyle: blood play, wet play. When you're cupping, as we talked about earlier, and you have wet cupping. You have knife play is kind of divided up into whether or not there's any risk of actually cutting or breaking the skin. Sometimes you have cupping that is deliberately set up to draw blood, the way leeches were used back in the Middle Ages. And so you make a small incision in the skin, and then you add this suction cup, and it just sucks all this blood out. And it can get pretty messy, and if you're not careful, it can also get very dangerous for the reasons we just talked about. Any other notions of what might have been edge play 20, 30 years ago but isn't now, or vice versa, Red?
No, because then I'd be showing my age.
Yeah, you're just a baby. Well, how about unprotected sex? I mean, that was not...
That has always been a red flag for me, unless I'm with my partner and we're monogamous, because of the inherent dangers in barebacking. I mean, there was a story, I don't know, about 10 years back about a woman who contracted AIDS, and she started sleeping with men in bars in Texas to infect as many men as she possibly could. She was going to take down as many people as she possibly could with her.
Yeah.
Because she was angry at it. And that's
a very scary thought. So we've been talking about some of the items or some of the activities that may have been on the list but no longer are, or may not have been on the list but are now. And we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the things that pretty much everyone agrees is edge play or extreme BDSM after the break. And that includes things like knife play, gun play, asphyxiation, rape play, and some others too. So we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to DS Radio. My name is Mike Makai. My co-host tonight is Little Red, and we'll be right back. Radio, and this is my chance to do a shameless plug for the book, which is Domination and Submission, the BDSM Relationship Handbook, which is available at Amazon, Books A Million, and Barnes & Noble, and is doing pretty darn well. I'm using the royal we there. I am making good progress on Volume 2, which is scheduled to come out in mid-April, so if you haven't read Volume 1 yet, you got a couple months because Volume 2's coming, and these are big books, so you got to start. So, Red, when are you going to write a book?
I thought I was helping you with yours and giving you awesome ideas, and I can stay in the background.
There you go. You are one of my muses, I guess. Also a great sounding board for some of this stuff. We discussed before the break some of the things that have recently become forms of extreme BDSM, and so now we're going to talk about some of the things that pretty much everyone agrees on that are considered extreme forms of BDSM. And I think the first one I want to talk about is erotic asphyxiation. Does this happen to be one of your kinks, Red?
Breath play is one of my kinks, yes.
So you like to be choked?
In
God
certain
knows
circumstances,
I want to choke you every once in a while, so.
Just because I happen to push your buttons and make you blush has nothing to do with it.
So you like erotic asphyxiation, huh?
I do, but it with certain people and in very, very limited settings, it's not something I would ever do in a dungeon, because then somebody gets the idea, oh, that's kind of cool, and they try it, and then you have crosses over the eyeballs and blue skin, and it's not okay, because it does take a very specific training kind of thing. It's not training per se, like you have to go learn how to do this way. But placing your hand across the windpipe and the trachea can inherently crush it. So you need to know how to do this properly so as to minimize that risk for you and your partner.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about cutting off the blood flow to the brain while you're choking somebody? Tell me a little bit about the risks that are inherent with that.
Some people do have medical conditions where they do have clotting issues, or they have thin blood. And if you cut that off, you're running the risk of stroke. You're running the risk of, obviously, asphyxiation, the true form of asphyxiation, to where they turn blue and 911 gets called. But the most major one would be for stroking out, because you are cutting off the supply to the brain, and that is your central have going. Otherwise, you are no longer you.
Now, there's a form of erotic asphyxiation. I have a hard time saying that word. There's a form of erotic asphyxiation called autoerotic asphyxiation, and this involves essentially choking yourself until you either become disoriented or almost pass out. Tell us a little bit about the dangers of that sort of thing.
Autoerotic asphyxiation, obviously, is where you're placing an instrument around your own throat, whether it be a belt or rope, a scarf. It could even be as simple as a pair of panties or a bra, and creating the same effect as your partner's hand around your throat, taking away that air supply. But some of the people take it a little too far, and they end up actually, for lack of a better term, committing suicide, because they pass out and there's nobody there to help them.
Sure. You know, a lot of people don't know this, but David Carradine, and again, I'm showing my age, but the star of the show Kung Fu, and he was also star of a lot of different spaghetti westerns and that sort of thing, but he died in, I think it was Hong Kong or Thailand. I think it was Thailand. He died of autoerotic asphyxiation. Here we've got a millionaire movie star staying in one of the ritziest hotels in Asia, and they found him hanging by his neck in the closet. Deliberately set up a situation where he was choking himself, near hanging himself during the act of masturbation, and went a little too far and killed himself. And so, I can think of a lot of different ways that I don't want to die, and that's probably at the top of my list, which is in the middle of masturbating in the closet. So, yeah, I think that this is something that you really, really have to take a long, hard look at. It's extremely dangerous, if for no other reason, because you're by yourself. Nobody can rescue you when it goes wrong. So if you are interested or fascinated by autoerotic asphyxiation, I would beg you not to do that when you're alone. Have somebody around so that when it goes wrong, you have some hope of surviving it. It's less dangerous if we're talking about just straight out erotic asphyxiation in terms of your partner is, if not really choking you, at least going through the motions, or there may be a little bit of a role play or a little bit of just getting that thrill of feeling like you're being choked. Now, Red, when you engage in erotic asphyxiation, do you ever pass out, or is it just the feel of a hand around your throat that's enough for you?
I've actually had lost consciousness during it for brief periods. It was a little bit further than I had intended it to go because I enjoy the disorientation. It's a nice kink for me, but I do not enjoy losing consciousness. So it got taken a little further than what was intended.
I see. Well, yeah, it can be dangerous in that regard, too, particularly if you're playing with somebody that you don't play with regularly, so you don't know how far they may or may not go or how much they know about what they're doing. So, I mean, it can be very dangerous in that regard, too, but less dangerous than doing it by yourself. So I would just caution folks to be careful if they're into either autoerotic asphyxiation or just straight-out erotic asphyxiation. Now, what about knife play? I think I've heard you say that you don't like knife play. Is that correct?
I don't like knife play when it comes to turning into blood play with it. Mm-hmm. The sensory play of knife play I do enjoy, especially when you are sensory depth, but you can still hear. You can hear the click of a knife. You can almost hear it slide across your skin, and that's a big kink turn on for me. When it turns into blood play with it is where my enjoyment stops.
Now, how much of the knife play or the appeal of the knife play hinges on the fear factor for you, Red?
Oh, it's definitely based on the fear factor because you don't know how sharp that knife is. I've done both standard knife play and I've also done electrical knife play, which takes it to a whole different level.
Yeah,
but it's that unknown factor.
When that electrical charge is transmitted through the knife, through the top's hand and the knife and the edge of the knife to your skin, it's kind of hard to distinguish between the edge of the knife being a sharp object versus the edge of the knife being an electrified object, and it's kind of a crazy sensation. How far is too far? As far as you're concerned, how far is too far when it comes to knife play? And obviously, you've mentioned, the point where they're drawing blood. But are you interested in the use of knife play as part of rape play, for example?
See, yes and no, because I can understand the fantasy of the rape play. I can understand the adrenaline rush you get from the fear, and it makes it more real when you see a large knife in front of you and, it's cutting away at clothes and you can feel it rasp against your skin. I can understand it. I personally wouldn't engage in that just for the simple fact that if you're struggling against your would-be rapist in the consensual non-consent play you're doing, the danger lies in that knife is sharp for a reason, and that is going to do some very serious damage depending on where it penetrates you at.
Yeah, that was going to be my point, which is that fear makes people do some crazy things. And while every ounce of your rationality tells you that nobody would, in a million years, lunge into a knife or jerk, their body into the blade, the fact is when people are afraid, when they are frightened, they will do irrational things. So I have seen people, when their impulse is to run away, but they run directly into whatever it is they're afraid of somehow. I've seen people jerk and twitch or somehow lunge into a blade or a tip of a knife, and so you got to be really, really, really careful, and you have to always assume that people are going to do the one thing you don't expect them to do, that you would never in a million years suspect that somebody would do that. And I've seen it firsthand in a lot of different scenarios, not necessarily just in BDSM scene scenarios, but I've seen it in other scenarios as well. And the human mind is wired to do some crazy stuff when you're frightened. And well, you were in the Army, Red. I mean, what do they teach you when you're ambushed? What's the only way to survive an ambush in the Army? Do you know this?
Kill them first.
No, it's to run directly into the gunfire. Because no, it is. It's the only way to survive.
No, I know.
And the reason is because ambushes are set up in the Army anyway. They're set up to make you do something. You know, and people shoot at you from one side of the road so that you'll run to the other side of the road, and that's where all the claymore mines are, and that's where you get blown up. So the gunfire isn't the dangerous part. They're just trying to get you to go run over there where you're going to get blown up by the mines. And it's very similar. Sometimes the only way to survive something like that is to do exactly the opposite of what they expect you to do. And unfortunately, some people react that way almost instinctively. I know I am. When I am frightened, and yes, I get frightened sometimes, I do exactly the opposite of what people would expect me to do, because I've just learned over the decades that that's what keeps you alive. And so never expect people to do the rational thing. You know, when you hold a knife in front of them, you might expect them to draw back. But strangely enough, some people will go right into the knife, and you're going to be left standing there going, oops, how did that happen? So be really careful and expect the unexpected. What about gunplay? Ever seen or engaged in gunplay as part of a BDSM scene, Red?
Absolutely not.
Mm-hmm.
That's a no.
You know, there are a lot of people out there who are just really, really turned on by this. I'm not one of them, but there are some people, and I think that this is probably going to be on the list of extreme BDSM activities for quite some time. Mainly because guns are not getting any more acceptable in polite society. I think they're becoming more and more outside the norm, at least to the average person on the street. So, but yeah, there are people who want to see it in their sex play in the bedroom. They do it a lot like the knife play. They just want to be frightened by something. It gets the adrenaline going, and it makes it all much more exciting. We've already talked about blood play. We've all talked a little bit about rape play. What about, again, these items are, for the most part, the majority of people believe that they are edge play. They are outside the mainstream. They're extreme forms of BDSM. What about age play? Do you think that's
I don't see that unless you're going, like on the way, complete infancy, diapers dependent on another person, and that you literally are that. Mm-hmm. I don't consider like the incest play or the age play to be edgy to me, because it is very acceptable for the daddy little girl. Or the mommy son. It's becoming more and more accepted within the kink community. Now,
you tend to consider yourself a little. Do you consider, when you incorporate that into your bedroom play, do you consider that age play, or is that just part of your personality? That you see what I'm saying? You're not pretending to be somebody that you're not, which would be age play, role play. Is it just a part of your personality and therefore not considered age play, not considered what other people might consider to be extreme or edgy?
Actually, believe it or not, I have never, ever had that scenario come up. I've worn pigtails. It's cute. I've worn the schoolgirl outfit. But it's never been, actually, I need my blinky, I need my stuffy, I'm not feeling okay. That has been a recent development, and it's been a recent development, but not one with my dom. He and I don't engage in any age play like that.
Gotcha. All right. Now, what about, and this is one that has probably always been on the list and probably will always be on the list, and that is scat and urine play. Any thoughts on those?
That is an absolute infection waiting to happen, biohazard at its greatest, right next to blood play, and that is a huge hard limit on my end. I don't even want to watch it. I don't want to be anywhere around it. I'm good, thanks. Have fun with that.
Well, I don't know a lot of people who would want to watch it. I think this is one of those things that if you're interested in it, you're fascinated by it, you generally practice those activities in the privacy of your own home. It's not something that you do at a dungeon or a play party or anything like that. But it is considered, strangely enough, it is almost universally considered to be extreme and edgy, even by the very tolerant people in this lifestyle, which I find kind of interesting. I mean, it's definitely not my kink either. But I find it very interesting the reactions that you get about it from other people. When you get these people who will say, "Oh, you can hang me up by hooks, you can slice off my fingers, you can do any of that stuff, but whatever you don't pee on me or something," And you're like, whoa, wait, all that other stuff can put you in the hospital for weeks, but you're worried about urine apparently. I'm not sure that it merits the universal disgust that it seems to enjoy. I've not ever really. Well, that's not necessarily true. I've actually known some people who are into those particular kinks, and I found it, off-putting, I guess is the best way to put it.
I think it's more the gross out factor than anything else. Vomit, scat, urine, anything like that. I think it's more the gross out factor than anything else, because of it's not, you don't find too many things in toy shops, Christie's, Castles, anything like that for those particular kind of play.
Well, they're so far
out. You can find medical equipment, but you can't find,
they're way
like
outside the mainstream. They're way outside the mainstream, and that's probably, it's a profit motive. If there's not enough people interested, they're just not going to sell it. Well, anyway, we have had a very interesting show tonight, talking about some extreme BDSM, and we want to thank you for tuning in, and hope that you will check in with us next week on Domination Submission Radio. My name is Mike Makai. My co-host is Little Red, and we'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye now.